The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that creeps into your bones. Judge Charles Bennett adjusted his glasses, preparing to deliver another routine verdict. But as the defendant raised his head, time seemed to stop. The man in chains, homeless, weary, and wrongfully accused, had a face Charles hadn't seen in over 40 years. A face from the summer of 1979. A boy who once took a beating meant for him. A boy who vanished after being arrested for a crime he didn't commit. Now, here he was, broken by the system Judge Bennett had sworn to uphold. What happened next would shock the entire courtroom, and change both of their lives forever. They brought him in through the side door, wearing cuffs that clinked louder than they should have. His clothes were torn, his shoes barely held together with frayed laces, and his face bore the weathered signs of years spent surviving on the streets. The bailiff didn't even look at him, just gestured toward the defendant's chair like it was a routine stop on a hopeless ride. For Marcus Reed, it was the same song, different courtroom. The charge was simple on paper: assault and theft. A store clerk claimed Marcus tried to steal groceries and attacked him when confronted. That was all the record said. No mention of the fact that Marcus hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. No mention of the fact that he'd tried to pay with crumpled bills and was shoved out before he could explain. No one cared. A homeless black man in a rich neighborhood. The gavel was practically ready before the judge even sat down. The courtroom was mostly empty, save for a few spectators, a young intern scribbling notes in the corner, and the prosecutor, who looked more interested in her watch than the case. The public defender beside Marcus didn't bother making eye contact, flipping through a thin file like he already knew how this story would end. Everyone did. Cases like this never made headlines. They just faded quietly into the archives. Then the door behind the bench opened, and Judge Charles Bennett walked in. Gray-haired, clean-cut, reputation as solid as the mahogany walls that surrounded him. He'd spent 30 years building a career on being firm but fair, impartial but tough. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just nodded slightly as he sat down and adjusted his glasses. He tapped his gavel once. State versus Marcus Reed. And then it happened. Marcus lifted his head. It was the first time he looked up since he entered the courtroom. For a split second, his eyes met the judge's, and everything stopped. The rustle of papers, the clicking of pens, the murmurs, it all vanished. The judge stared at Marcus, his mouth parting ever so slightly. Behind the robe, behind the decades of discipline and detachment, something shifted in his face. His grip on the gavel loosened. The color drained from his skin. He knew that face, not just in passing, not from another trial or a newspaper. No. This recognition was deeper. It came from the bones, from memory, from childhood. That crooked nose, the scar just below the chin. Those eyes, older now, but still sharp with quiet fire. It had been over 40 years. The name on the case file was Marcus Reed. But Judge Charles Bennett didn't need the name to remember. He already knew who the man sitting before him truly was. Not a defendant, not a criminal, but a boy from another life. A boy from a summer long buried beneath years of status, education, and forgetting. Charles had been just a skinny white kid from a working-class neighborhood in Birmingham. His father sold insurance. His mother made boxed casseroles and warned him not to play in the wrong parts of town. But Charles didn't listen. He liked adventure, and he found it when he met Marcus. Marcus was fast, brave, and smarter than anyone gave him credit for. They became inseparable, played stickball in alleys, swapped lunches, built forts out of trash and dreams. In those days, none of the differences mattered. Not skin, not money, not the invisible lines that adults used to draw. They were just kids, chasing summer. Until the day it all changed. One hot August afternoon, some older boys caught them walking together near the train yard. They didn't like what they saw. White boy, black boy, laughing like brothers. Charles would never forget how fast the smiles faded. He remembered the push, the shouts, the first punch. But before it could land, Marcus had stepped in front of him, took the hit himself, and more. Fists, boots, blood. When the police came, they didn't arrest the attackers. They arrested Marcus. Stolen bike, they claimed, even though he never touched one. Charles had tried to speak up, but the officers told him to go home. His parents pulled him out of the neighborhood that same week. They told him to forget it, that it was just a rough area, that he had been lucky. And he did forget, or at least he tried. He went to college, law school, passed the bar, built a life. But now, decades later, sitting high above a courtroom, the past had walked right back in, wearing shackles. Marcus didn't blink, didn't smile. He just stared, like he didn't recognize the man behind the bench. Or maybe he did, and he simply didn't care. Maybe he'd learned a long time ago that recognition didn't mean rescue. That familiar faces were just ghosts in better suits. Judge Bennett lowered his gaze and cleared his throat. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the case file. But the words on the page didn't matter anymore. Nothing written there could tell the truth about the man in front of him. Because Marcus Reed wasn't just another defendant. He was a living reminder of a debt that had never been repaid. They had been boys in a world that didn't know what to do with their friendship. Charles came from a small white family on the east side of Birmingham, a neighborhood full of fences, trimmed lawns, and whispered warnings. Marcus lived just 5 blocks away, but it might as well have been another country. His neighborhood had cracked sidewalks, chain-link fences bent inward like they were trying to hold something in, and kids who learned early that police sirens never meant safety. Their paths crossed by accident. A pickup baseball game in a public park, 1 glove short, and Charles offered to share his. Marcus said yes. That was all it took. By the end of that summer, they were spending every free minute together, riding bikes down abandoned lots, sneaking into the city pool through a hole in the fence, trading comic books and secrets. Charles had the luxury of innocence. Marcus had the wisdom of survival. Together they met in the middle. Adults noticed, some with disapproval, some with anger. Charles's father told him it wasn't safe to be in that part of town. Marcus's older cousins warned him not to get too close to a kid who could call the cops and be believed without question. But boys don't see skin when they're laughing. They don't count zip codes when they're chasing down fly balls or sharing peanut butter sandwiches. They see loyalty. They see fun. They see a brother. Then came the day everything changed. It had started like any other Saturday, hot, dusty, full of nothing and possibility. Charles had dared Marcus to race him through the train yard, past the freight cars that rumbled like giants in their sleep. But they never made it. A group of older white teens blocked their path, wearing smirks that didn't reach their eyes. One of them had a bat. Another had questions. What was a white boy doing with an dare? Did he think they were equal? Charles had barely opened his mouth before the fists started flying. He'd never been in a real fight. Didn't even raise his hands. But Marcus had. He'd leapt in front of Charles without hesitation, without a thought for himself. He took the first punch, then the second. Charles remembered the sound more than the pain. A thud, a crack, a sickening gasp. Marcus bled in the dirt while Charles stood frozen, tears mixing with fear. The sirens came late. The story they believed was the one told by the boys with clean shirts and pale faces. A stolen bicycle lay nearby, left by someone else, forgotten until it became a convenient piece of fiction. Marcus was blamed. He was cuffed on the spot. Charles had shouted, tried to explain, but the officer put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Go home, son. This doesn't concern you." Charles's parents were furious, not at the injustice, but that their son had been exposed to danger. That very night, they packed bags. Within days, the Bennetts had moved to a nearby suburb. New school, new life, new friends. Charles was told to forget, that boys like Marcus were trouble, that nothing good ever came from crossing those lines. But forgetting wasn't so easy. Charles carried Marcus with him in ways he didn't talk about, in the way he flinched at sudden noises, in the way he stayed quiet when friends told racist jokes, in the way he worked twice as hard in law school, always feeling like he owed something, though he didn't know what. Marcus, meanwhile, never had the luxury of forgetting. He was 13 when he entered the juvenile system. He didn't have a lawyer, just a tired public defender juggling too many cases. He spent 2 years in a detention center for a crime he never committed. By the time he got out, the world had changed, but not for the better. His school had forgotten him. His record followed him. He learned that justice wasn't blind. It just refused to look in his direction. Over the years, Marcus drifted through life like a ghost no one wanted to see. He took odd jobs, slept in shelters, spent winters wrapped in newspaper. Sometimes he'd stare at courthouse steps and wonder what might have happened if Charles had spoken louder, if someone had listened, if the system had cared. But he never expected to see Charles again. Not like this. Not in a courtroom, wearing a robe and holding his fate in his hands. The boy who once promised they'd be best friends forever had grown up to become a judge. And Marcus? He had become the kind of man that judges sent away without a second thought. 2 lives, 2 directions, split by a single moment of injustice. And now, fate had dragged them back into the same room. One with power, the other with chains. And all the unspoken history hung between them like smoke that refused to clear. The charges against Marcus were thin, but they were wrapped in confidence. The clerk's statement, written hastily in block letters, claimed that Marcus entered the store just before closing time, attempted to leave with a bag of unpaid items, and struck the clerk when confronted. No camera footage was submitted into evidence. No injuries were medically documented. And yet, the prosecution approached the case as if it were already decided. This was not unusual. In cases like this, small crimes pinned on people with long records, the burden of proof often shifted from the state to the defendant. Jurors were quietly encouraged to look at Marcus's past instead of the present accusation. Words like habitual, transient, and repeat offender floated between the lines of the prosecutor's tone. The facts mattered less than the image painted. Marcus wasn't on trial for this crime. He was on trial for the life he had lived. The defense, underfunded and uninterested, offered little resistance. The public defender read aloud a short statement Marcus had written, insisting he had not stolen anything and had only raised his voice after the clerk accused him without reason. The bag Marcus carried had a receipt from another store, time-stamped earlier that afternoon. It was never reviewed. The attorney didn't push the point. There were no character witnesses, no investigations into the store's prior altercations with homeless people, no attempt to humanize Marcus. To the court, he was a file number. A man in handcuffs who had been arrested more times than anyone could count. A figure defined by failures. But Judge Bennett saw something different. With every word spoken, he watched Marcus closely. Not just his posture, but his silence. Marcus didn't interrupt, didn't protest. He sat quietly, as if the trial were background noise to a lifetime of injustice he had learned to endure. He had lived this routine too many times before. Walk in, hear the accusations, listen as strangers talk about your life like it's a headline, then walk back out in chains. It was theater. And Marcus had long stopped believing it was written for him. The prosecution's witness, the store clerk, took the stand with the energy of someone used to being believed. He described Marcus as aggressive, unstable, muttering threats. Said he feared for his safety. But under cross-examination, brief and forgettable, it was revealed that the clerk had no visible injuries, had not filed a medical report, and had refused to provide surveillance footage from the store's cameras. He claimed they were not operational, though his earlier statement had mentioned checking them after the incident.
Still, no one pressed the contradiction. No one except Judge Bennett. As the case limped forward, Judge Bennett found himself questioning not just the evidence but his own assumptions. He scanned the details, replaying each moment like an echo. He read Marcus's name again and again, as if trying to separate the man before him from the boy who once stood between him and a world ready to break them apart. But they were the same. The same strength. The same silence. The same eyes that had once stared up from a dirt-covered alley, refusing to cry even as blood trickled down his face. The law required impartiality. But what about morality? What about justice, real justice, not the kind printed in books but the kind that recognized history, pain, and resilience? Judge Bennett began to look deeper. He requested a review of Marcus's prior convictions and saw a pattern. Dozens of arrests over 30 years, but nearly all for misdemeanors, trespassing, loitering, minor theft, public disturbance. No violent felonies. No weapons. Just a man struggling to exist in a society that treated his poverty like a crime. He noticed how many times Marcus had been denied legal counsel. How often he'd pleaded guilty just to avoid extended jail time while awaiting trial. How many times he had been pushed through the system like a ghost everyone was too busy to see. This wasn't just a man with a record. This was a man who had been failed, repeatedly and unapologetically, by the very system now asking for judgment. Still, the judge couldn't speak his thoughts aloud. The rules held him in place. He had to pretend this was just another day, just another case. But inside, something was shifting. Marcus sat alone at the defense table, a figure so still it was as if time refused to touch him. The courtroom couldn't hear the years in his silence, couldn't see the child who once saved a friend from hate and was repaid with a future in chains. The trial was nearing its end. The evidence was weak, the testimony shaky, but the weight of Marcus's past made acquittal feel like a political risk. Judges were expected to move cases along, to maintain order, to balance the books, not to reach back into the past and atone for what had been buried. And yet, as Judge Bennett reviewed the case notes one final time, his hand trembled ever so slightly. He was no longer holding just a file. He was holding a man's life. And buried inside that man's silence was a truth that refused to die. The courtroom was built for finality, its walls designed to echo authority, its benches to separate the powerful from the powerless. But for Judge Charles Bennett, the silence after the closing arguments was deafening. In that quiet, the past whispered louder than any voice in the room. Every protocol he followed, every ruling he issued, was now weighted by something deeper than procedure. It was personal, undeniable, and irreversible. He had taken an oath. He had sworn to uphold the law without fear or favor. But the law, as written, had long ago failed Marcus. The system hadn't just stumbled, it had trampled. Over innocence. Over youth. Over potential. Charles could see it now as clearly as if it had been written in red ink across every page of Marcus's record. It wasn't a record of guilt, it was a record of abandonment. As the judge reviewed the prosecution's file once more, he saw what was missing more clearly than what was there. There was no motive. No injury. No credible proof. The testimony from the store clerk was riddled with contradiction, and the defense, though weak, had pointed to inconsistencies that no one bothered to examine further. But it wasn't the case's weakness that disturbed Charles most, it was how easily the court system allowed that weakness to masquerade as strength when the defendant looked like Marcus. Charles reflected on how many men like Marcus had stood in front of him. How often he had sentenced people based on records thicker than their files. How he had grown numb to stories that began in poverty and ended in prison. How justice had been reduced to routine. And now, for the first time, the numbness was cracking. He remembered Marcus not as the defendant, but as a boy. The one who leapt into danger to protect him. The one who never had a choice, not when the fists landed, not when the siren screamed, not when the cuffs clicked shut. And Charles remembered himself, not as a judge, but as a child who ran away. A child who was told to forget. A child who obeyed. The shame settled heavily on his shoulders. He had gone on to law school, to clerkships, to firm partnerships, and finally to the bench. Along the way, he'd convinced himself that his success was earned. That he had risen by merit. That the law, for all its flaws, still offered fairness if applied correctly. But Marcus was living proof that merit meant little when you were born into struggle, when you were denied even the smallest presumption of innocence, when your whole life became evidence against you. Charles thought of all the missed chances. He had never tried to find Marcus. Never asked what happened after that day in the train yard. He had built a career on facts and rulings, but he had never sought the truth that really mattered. That his friend had been stolen from him, not just by fists, but by silence. By indifference. By a system they were both too young to understand but old enough to be crushed by. Now, in the present, he was being offered something rare, a second chance to do what was right. But doing what was right meant more than issuing a verdict. It meant standing against the tide of quiet expectation. The unspoken pressure from colleagues, donors, and even the community that wanted quick decisions and clean stories. It meant challenging the unspoken rule that poor black men with long records were easy to convict and easier to forget. Charles could feel the weight of the gavel. A symbol of justice, yes, but also of judgment. And now it trembled in his hand like a memory trying to come back to life. He thought of the others, those who never had someone on the bench who recognized their face. Those whose stories would never be reopened. Whose lives had been swallowed by steel bars and bureaucratic indifference. He could not save them all. But he could start with one. He knew what the law permitted. But he also knew what his conscience demanded. He could acquit Marcus based on the evidence alone. That would be legally sound. But it wouldn't be enough. Not after all these years. Not after all the damage. Marcus didn't need pity. He needed the truth spoken aloud. He needed someone in power to finally say what had never been said, that the system had failed him. That it had stolen his youth, his dignity, and nearly his life. This case had become more than a verdict. It had become a reckoning. Justice, real justice, was not found in the easy route. It lived in the discomfort of honesty. In the willingness to face failure and still choose mercy. And for Charles, it meant facing his own fear, that admitting the system was broken also meant admitting he had been a part of breaking it. But there was no turning back now. The past had walked into his courtroom wearing shackles. And it had stared him in the eye. Now it was his turn to answer. When the courtroom reconvened, the air was thick with assumptions. Another day, another verdict. The people who had seen this play out before expected the script to remain the same. A guilty verdict. A nod to procedure. A nod to Marcus's history, his record, his presumed tendencies. The outcome, for many, felt preordained, not because of the facts, but because of the face sitting at the defendant's table. But what they didn't know was that the man in the robe had changed. Judge Bennett had entered that courtroom a man divided between law and loyalty, between duty and memory. But he now stood fully awake, not just to Marcus's truth, but to the deeper failure they were both caught in, the failure of a system that demanded obedience but rarely delivered justice to those it had already pushed to the edge. The courtroom did not expect compassion. It was trained to expect convenience. The legal machine moved quickly, efficiently, and impersonally. It counted wins, not wisdom. But Judge Bennett chose not to continue that tradition. He chose, instead, to make this moment matter. The verdict he gave was not delivered in haste. It was spoken with the weight of years behind it, years of silence, of forgetting, of avoiding truths that had clawed at the edges of his conscience. He declared Marcus not guilty. Not merely due to reasonable doubt, but because the state had failed at every level to present a case built on truth. The evidence had not held up. The testimony had not been credible. And most of all, the system had been biased from the start. But the judge went further. He addressed not just the facts of the case but the context. He spoke of how Marcus's long list of prior arrests reflected a cycle of poverty and profiling, not proof of character. He spoke of how the court system often punishes not only actions but identities, how a man who looks like Marcus is too often presumed guilty before he ever speaks. He acknowledged, for the record, that the legal process had historically failed to account for racial disparities, for economic trauma, for the simple fact that survival often looks like rebellion when viewed through the wrong lens. This wasn't just a ruling, it was a confession. A confession from the bench. A man in power finally acknowledging that the system he had sworn to uphold was not blind, it just turned its eyes away from certain people. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. What had been expected to be a routine ruling had become something else entirely, a public reckoning. The judge's voice didn't tremble, but it carried a different tone, one not often heard in courtrooms. Humility. Accountability. Truth. He spoke of second chances. But more than that, he spoke of stolen chances, of how people like Marcus had never truly been given a first one. How their mistakes were never measured with the same mercy afforded to others. How justice, when filtered through prejudice, loses its soul. He didn't pretend that a single verdict could undo decades of harm. He didn't offer false hope. But he made clear that in this courtroom, on this day, the cycle would stop. At least for one man. At least for one moment. The impact was immediate. Legal observers who had long grown cynical sat forward in their seats. Reporters who had come to write a predictable story about recidivism and petty crime instead found themselves scribbling down something entirely different, a story about courage from the bench, about a judge who broke ranks not for politics, but for principle. For Marcus, the verdict meant more than freedom. It meant acknowledgement. For the first time, someone in authority had looked at his life and seen more than a file. Someone had recognized the boy he once was, the man he had become, and the cost of all he had endured. And for Judge Bennett, the decision marked a turning point. No longer just a gatekeeper for the law, he had become something else, an advocate for its reform. In speaking honestly, he had exposed a flaw too deep to ignore. He had called out a pattern too cruel to keep pretending it didn't exist. And in doing so, he had invited others to confront it as well. The verdict rippled outward. Advocacy groups took notice. Legal aid organizations began revisiting similar cases. Young public defenders, often burned out and demoralized, found a renewed sense of purpose. And in legal circles where silence had long been rewarded, the judge's stand became a conversation too loud to avoid. It wasn't just about Marcus. It was about everyone like him. Every name in the system who had been reduced to a statistic. Every soul that had been buried under paperwork and prejudice. The courtroom had long been a place of judgment. But on that day, it became a place of truth. Freedom, once returned, does not immediately feel like freedom. For Marcus, stepping outside the courtroom without handcuffs didn't erase the years he had spent defined by numbers, case numbers, arrest records, cell blocks. The world had changed since his youth, but the streets hadn't. The same corner stores, the same alleys, the same looks from strangers who'd heard his name before. Except now, something was different. His name wasn't just tied to a rap sheet, it was tied to a story. A story of survival. A story of justice, finally served. He was no longer invisible. Across the city, newspapers, podcasts, and evening news stations picked up the story. Not just of the case, but of the connection between a judge and the boy he once left behind. It became a mirror held up to the justice system, a reminder that behind every defendant's name was a life, a past, and sometimes a history shared with the very people who held their fates. The spotlight was uncomfortable for both men. But while Marcus had lived in society's shadows for too long, Judge Bennett had lived on its pedestals. Now, neither of them could hide. They were both being asked to explain, not just what had happened, but what it meant. And the truth was, neither had all the answers. Marcus didn't know what came next. The streets that had once felt like home now seemed too small, too dangerous, too full of reminders. He wasn't a boy anymore. And yet, in many ways, he hadn't had the chance to grow into a man on his own terms. The years had stolen time, but not resolve. He knew that his freedom couldn't be the end of the story. Not while so many others still sat waiting for their day in court, still hoping for someone who might finally see them as more than a record. So, he began to speak. At youth centers. At community meetings. Not as a victim, but as a witness, to what happens when society gives up on a child too soon, and how redemption is still possible, even after decades of silence. His words didn't come polished. They came real. And real was what people needed to hear. Meanwhile, Judge Bennett also found himself changed. The robe still hung in his chambers, but its weight was no longer just ceremonial. It was a daily reminder that the law was not neutral unless made so by people who dared to confront its flaws. He began to advocate from within, pushing for programs that diverted young offenders from incarceration, calling for judicial training that focused on racial bias, and meeting with lawmakers to support sentencing reform. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as late. Late to truth. Late to courage. But determined to make up for time lost. Their story began to inspire others. Judges in other cities began reviewing cases that mirrored Marcus's. Legal clinics expanded their scope, supported by volunteers who had once felt powerless. And perhaps most importantly, young black boys sitting in classrooms and juvenile halls heard about Marcus, not as another mugshot, but as a man whose life defied what the system expected. A man who had been seen. And in that recognition was a new kind of power. Marcus and Charles, no longer boys but not yet healed men, found themselves linked in more than memory. Their lives had diverged, but their futures began to overlap in service. They launched an initiative together, an education and legal mentorship program in the very neighborhood where they first met. It wasn't about charity. It was about change. Structural, intentional, and born from the pain they had both carried in silence for too long. They understood that real justice doesn't live only in verdicts, it lives in what happens after. In how a man rebuilds. In how a judge atones. In how a community reclaims the children it once lost. What had started as a chance courtroom encounter became a national conversation, not just about justice, but about grace. About how two lives that were separated by circumstance were reunited by accountability. And how, through that reunion, something larger was born, a roadmap for redemption. Marcus was no longer a case. He was a catalyst. Judge Bennett was no longer just a jurist. He was a reformer. Together, they represented what the system so rarely allows, a full circle. One that didn't erase the past but faced it head-on, and still dared to build something better from its ruins. Two boys, once lost in different directions, had finally found a future worth sharing. Not because the system gave it to them, but because they demanded more, from it, and from themselves. And so, in a courtroom built on silence, a voice finally broke through. One man's courage to speak the truth, on both sides of the bench, sparked a ripple that reached far beyond verdicts and headlines. What started as a trial became a turning point. What seemed like a routine hearing became a call for change. Marcus and Judge Bennett proved that the past doesn't have to define us. That even in a system built to divide, empathy can still unite. And that sometimes, the greatest justice isn't found in punishment, but in understanding. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And remember, one act of recognition, one moment of courage, can rewrite a life, and maybe even the world around it. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and never underestimate the power of second chances.